Vanderhill interviewing Martin D. Schwartz, Muncie Jewish Oral History Project 2, and the date is February 26, 2003. Marty, I'd like to begin with a general question before we begin to talk specifically about Temple Beth-El, and that is to ask you a question kind of based on one that I've asked all of our participants, but perhaps with a little bit different historical construct, and that is, having lived your life in Muncie, Indiana, most of it anyway, what do you think are the most important changes that you've observed in the community over, let's say, the past 3-4 decades?
Well, in the first place, it's a much more open community than it was in general. Of course, I'm being sort of a jackleg historian myself. I keep thinking of my experiences as an undergraduate in college and writing about the Klan in Indiana. And that was in the 1920s, this was a very significant fact of life for the state of Indiana, and obviously Muncie. And of course, I knew a lot of these people. I always played with their children and everything like that. But it was still, the lines were imperceptible, but very obvious. And you didn't cross them. It's much more open now. And of course, I think the presence of the university, the growth of the universities had a lot to do with the entire development of that openness. Of course, I grew up in a business environment, but an entrepreneurial one that hardly exists, it seems to me, anymore. And that's kind of general too. That's not only in Muncie, that's the state, that's the country. I don't see the mom and pop grocery stores, the men's clothing stores, all those things that used to be here. I remember streetcars in Muncie. They were wonderful. And the interurbans and things like that. Everybody, I mean, this is a mobile society in automobiles. The whole thing has changed enormously, but I don't know whether these are things peculiar to Muncie or peculiar to the United States.
So they happen, in your view, as much in the nation's Middletown as they do in lots of other middle towns across the United States.
Absolutely.
And largely for the same reasons.
Yeah, that's precisely my point.
You grew up in a generation where a lot of people who were members of Temple Beth-El were business people who had establishments downtown, when there was a real downtown here.
Yeah.
Now, you're living at a time when there are feverish attempts to try to bring back the downtown in Muncie. From your perspective, do you think that can happen?
Well, anything can happen if someone wills it and somebody puts the money behind it. Anything can happen.
And people will go there to do that.
But I would have a great deal of doubt as to whether there would ever become a vibrant downtown like I knew it as a kid, or even when we were married 62 years ago.
Or even when I came here in the late 1960s, it was a vibrant downtown.
Yeah, well, all right. You couldn't walk down Walnut Street on Saturday night without bumping into somebody or lots of people you knew. That was the venue that people attended. But there were soda fountains, there were Terhunes, there was Polly Parrott, there was Hastings. There were names that are coming to me. Hell, I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I can remember those things. And it was a completely different environment. However, I'll tell you another reason I don't think that's likely to happen unless there's some massive effort or coordinated effort on the part of the community and the city and everybody in it, and money. We have an automotive society. People are not going to drive down to Muncie, to the main town, and try to park. We didn't used to in the 20s and 30s, you walked down.
Right. Yeah.
And it was, or you had the streetcar. But it's a whole different environment now.
Okay, let me put this a little bit differently. How would you describe your life in Muncie as a member of the Jewish community?
How would I describe my life?
Yeah, how important is being a part of the Muncie Jewish community to you?
Well, it was obviously a major part of my life, always has been, and I knew very clearly what the restrictions, whatever they may mean, were, but really they never bothered me a great deal because I never felt personally deprived or hemmed in by that fact. I was annoyed, for example, when we built this house in 1950, that we couldn't build across the street. You've heard this story before, but you know, it's not been it was never a negative factor in my life. Now, Helen and I did realized later in life, that it had more effect on our children than we recognized. I think some of them were really turned off of their Jewish heritage, rejected it, not too vociferously to us because they knew it was important to us, because they had things happen to them where they were kept out of things, and we didn't really realize it at the time. Not that we didn't think we were articulate or that we weren't close to our children. We thought they opened up to us all the time, but we have found out later in life that there were things we did not know, and they didn't want us to know because they didn't want us to be hurt.
I think all parents think that.
Do they?
Well,
you
yeah,
mean
we've experienced that with our kids. I mean, you think that they have opened up and that there's a fairly good open line of communication, and indeed you find out years later that there were things that were very important to them at a particular time in their lives that they want to open in sharing with mother and father.
I was only relating those aspects to the Jewish situation.
I want to ask a specific question, which I can't imagine in all the years that we've known each other and worked together, I haven't asked you this question, but go back to 1950. Mm-hmm. And when you say that you built this house here, and if you'd wanted to, you could not have built it across the street, which in this case, for future references, Tillotson Avenue. How did you find that out? Did someone tell you you could build the house there?
Oh, well, we had a very specific example. We had made a deal to buy a lot across the street, and Alex Bracken, I talked to him. He was handling the real estate at that time. He was at Ball Brothers, and he said, "Oh yeah, wonderful, fine, and everything." And I said, "Fine, I'll take it." And we had an agreement, a verbal. 2 days later, he called me. He said, "I'm sorry, it's not available. It's already some Mickey Mouse answer. It's been taken or something." It was never taken or anything like that.
So it's that blunt.
Oh, it was blunt.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was pretty blunt.
That's pretty blunt.
Yeah.
I would agree with you.
And it was all very pleasant and everything like that. Well, it's tough. Well, I knew what the rules were, the unwritten rules. And what the interesting thing to me is that it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that I think it wasn't Atherton the one that
Atherton bought the old president's house.
No, but that decided to get that
Oh,
restrictive covenant out.
Yeah.
Of course, it became illegal afterward.
Yeah.
They couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about 1950. It was still very much in effect. And that's exactly, so we said, well, we'd like to be in this end of town, and we are restricted, and we'll see what we can find. And that's why we are here now. We've been very happy here, and we raised our kids here. And we're still in the old homestead.
Great location, though.
Yeah.
How important is being a member of Temple Bethel to you?
Well, it kind of came with the territory. I never thought about it in terms of membership per se. I was part of the Jewish community of Muncie, and that went with it. Now, interestingly enough, the assumption of a lot of people in the general community was that if you were Jewish, you were automatically a member of the temple or knew about it. And I remember the attorney, Earl Defer, at one time, who was representing my family when my father passed away. He handled his estate. The question came up, the name of Max Ziegler, you may have heard of, came up. And he said, well, he's a member of your congregation. Or your... I looked at him, I said, no, he's never been in the building as far as I know. And that seemed to be startling. But there have always been Jews around Muncie who never, ever were a part of the congregation. And then there were, I can think of certain names which are not important now, people that were ambivalent. They were in sometimes and out sometimes, but very clearly they let people know when they were in and they let them know when they were out. They were not what I called steady customers, regular, dependable, old-time members.
Did they identify themselves publicly as being Jewish?
Well, yes, I would say they did. Nobody questioned them about it. They were Jews, but you see, the general public made assumptions. And these assumptions were not correct, because I can think of several people who were prominent Jews, merchants, business people who never, ever were a part of that congregation.
Well, I can recall that came up in the study I did 23 years ago with people like Sherman Sig, Bud Roth, that they certainly consider themselves to be Jewish in the sense of cultural Jews, but they, by that point in their lives, they certainly had nothing to do with Temple Bethel.
Well, you're bringing up another sort of general important thing. You talk about cultural Jews and you talk about religious Jews. Now, I want to be honest, because I've thought a lot about this during my life. I am not what I would call a religious Jew, but I am certainly a dedicated member of the Jewish community, whatever it may be. Now, you may call it cultural, you may call it ethnic, you may call it whatever you want. But I have never separated myself. I've always considered myself very definitely an active, a Jewish activist.
Well, to be part of the community, because I think being part of the community, if you're really going to be part of it in the sense that you are involved with it, in this community, it seems to me, pretty much means that you're going to be part of Temple Bethel. Because there's no other Jewish community in Muncie, Indiana, outside of Temple Bethel that has any real sense of community.
That's true, or organization.
Yeah,
that's true.
Okay.
That's true.
You touched on this a few moments ago, but the question belongs here, and since I really want to try to keep some of these things together. When I interviewed you 23 years ago, one of the questions that I raised was to ask you to talk about relationships in the community between Jewish people and non-Jewish people. And in this study, I've been asking each of the participants the same question, largely because I want to have people comment on whether or not they think that the issues that were there, that you certainly touched upon in your life, are still really important barriers to relationships between Jewish people in Muncie and non-Jewish people in Muncie.
No, they definitely are not. No, that's been one of the major changes, cultural, psychological, and emotional and philosophical changes that have taken place in the community. The barriers are not there. There were.
Would you say there's more understanding as well as toleration than there may have been 23 years ago?
Well, Warren, to say there's more understanding, and I'm going to use both of your words, probably is not true. I think the whole society is a more open society. I don't think people consciously, non-Jews, think that they're being more open to Jews per se, any more than they are to blacks or any other ethnic group. You used the word toleration.
Yeah. Or tolerance.
Or tolerant, yeah. I think that the whole society that we live in has become more tolerant of differences, all kinds of differences. Look at the women's movement, for example. There's a perfect, can you imagine 50 years ago having women in some of the positions they are? Look at your successor at Ball State.
No, I don't. 50 years ago, I certainly couldn't have imagined.
No, it wouldn't have happened, that's all. And 25 years ago, it might have been breaking down a little, but, you know, it ain't there. It wasn't there then.
Okay.
That's kind of where I'm.
Okay. I didn't ask you this in the first study, although I thought of it. And in this study, I've been asking everyone. Have you in your life experienced overt or covert anti-Semitism?
Oh, yes. No question about that.
Okay. Well, are you willing to give some examples?
Well, I've never dwelt on a lot of it.
Okay.
But I think the overt anti-Semitism would have been in some of the situations. Well, let me put it this way. It was an open fact when I was an undergraduate at Harvard that being Jewish meant that you would not be on the Harvard Crimson, that you would not be in any of the final clubs, they called them, or any of the eating clubs, that you would not be here, there, or the other. And I remember when that was, I may have said this in the first interview, I don't remember, when that was first presented to me the first day I got to Harvard by a person who became a good friend of mine, who was a junior at that time. And he came up to my room and told me all the things that I couldn't do because I was Jewish. And I said, hell, I can do all those things in Muncie, Indiana. I don't have to come here and find that out. And I remember in those days I sent a steamer trunk ahead. That was in 1934. You didn't, you didn't go the way we do now. I had not unpacked my steamer trunk. And after he got through talking to me for an hour and telling me what I couldn't do because I was Jewish, I said, you know, I must have come to the wrong place. I think I better not unpack this trunk. I think maybe we ought to go back to Muncie. And I was about to do that until I got thinking about my father, who was paralyzed. And this was a big deal that his kid from Muncie was admitted to Harvard. And I was afraid that if I pulled out without starting, that I would kill him. And I stayed. And of course, very frankly, I had a wonderful experience after that. Because I broke down, let's put it this way, I didn't break down barriers, I walked through a lot of them. There, that's what I mean, just to use it for.
Specific questions about the temple that I know we've spent a lot of time talking about without doing any tape recordings. How do you see the future of Temple Bethel?
You know, Warren, I've compared Muncie this little Jewish community, which I've known all my life, with similar communities, let's say Anderson. The fact that a few Jews back in the early 1920s, after World War I, were able to put enough money together to get a mortgage and build that structure was a very significant thing, because it didn't happen in a lot of these other places. And therefore there was no, I think, a physical building, a place of congregation, for congregation, made a hell of a lot of difference. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that there was a community that existed even through the Depression. And I remember how tough it was in the Depression. It's still tough, but nothing like that. Newcastle didn't have anything. Richmond did have something, Kokomo, Marion, but Muncie had a unique position as far as a small Jewish community was concerned, because there was a structure here, a focus that wasn't in other places. I don't know whether, that's how I think it's always been very important. Of course, we don't call it, I mean, if you're really au courant, you don't call it the temple anymore, it's a synagogue.
Right.
The temple was a term developed by the German Reform Jews to hearken back to the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was the connection.
Yeah. How significant to the future of Temple Bethel do you think that the addition to the building?
Well, of course, I think it's been absolutely vital. The fact that people are excited about it. People never were excited about going to that old structure. I mean, my God, we had to go to the basement, you know.
Well, that was nice.
I'm not arguing. The fact that it was created to be a meeting place, a place of congregation, a place of event, put an awful lot of excitement in. I think it's very significant. And a lot of things have happened since then.
Oh, yeah.
I think it brought a lot of people out of the woodwork. Now, you know, we've talked about this before in other connections. There have always been Jews here that never were connected. I think it has brought some of those people into the structure. And, of course, I think it's brought some of the two major new groups, the university group and the medical group, in that wouldn't have come around.
One of the issues that has come up in the course of doing these interviews is the very important role played currently by non-Jewish spouses. And when I've talked to people now, almost 24 who are part of this study, I get different reactions to that. And I'd like you, from your view of being a longtime member of Temple Bethel, to comment on how you see the non-Jewish spouses and what you think the role for them should be in the life of the congregation.
Well, number one, when you talk about non-Jewish spouses, and that can be either male or female.
Oh yeah, and it is.
It is. The fact that the Jewish part comes to the synagogue, comes to the services, and is then interested, usually would not happen if the spouse, whichever he or she may be, did not concur or at least didn't object to that person's activity. I am not in any way offended by having many non-Jewish spouses. It doesn't bother me that much. I think maybe they'll learn something if they come. I think there's a learning curve involved. If a person has become converted, as several of them have, then strictly speaking, they are Jews,
Right.
whether they were born that way or
Right.
not.
Right.
I think that there's more opportunity to find converts, committed converts to Judaism by welcoming the non-Jewish spouse than making it tough for them. And let me tell you, I can remember way back, and I can name names, where it was terrible for a non-Jewish spouse because he or she was absolutely ostracized by the majority of the people. And then, of course, we had this terrible dust-up, if you will, with Susan Weintraub, about, 10 years ago. Has it been that long? It was a wonderful thing when she left Muncie. It came alive again.
Help the congregation.
It helped the congregation enormously, and it's amazing how the fervor of an whatever it may be, can poison the well, as it were. This well was badly poisoned, and it took a lot of years to get it over. And it's amazing to me the strength that I detect in the community now, where that kind of objection isn't in. You know, Helen was the chairman of a constitutional revisions committee that Bernard Friend, I, Bob Coor, I don't know who else was there. I think that was, we worked on it for a whole year, and we had a beautiful, we took care of a lot of old problems, we thought. And when it came up to a congregational meeting, Susan and her cohorts completely devastated the whole thing, and nothing has ever been changed. That Constitution has never been altered since then. And Helen did a tremendous job on it, but it's been almost 10 years ago. Now, I was just reading Arthur Hertzberg's new book called A Jew in America. It's a wonderful, to me, it's so evocative of everything I've lived through. He's my age, but he came from a Orthodox background. And he said he's learned in his life to distrust anyone who has absolute truth. Well, you don't have to be a rabbi or anything else, but that's kind of where I'm from.
Kind of a true believer approach.
A true believer, right.
Let's talk about a Martin Schwartz and Helen Schwartz wish list. This is a nice time of the year for wish lists. If you had some wishes for the future of Temple Bethel that might help to ensure its future, what kinds of things would you put on that list?
Well, I know that several people have said that a permanent rabbi would be a great addition. I agree it would be, but to me that floats away from reality. This is not a large enough community to entice the kind of person that I think would find it productive, amenable, and useful, and would be able to function on any meaningful basis as a rabbi. Secondly, there aren't enough bodies yet. I think if I were brought in as either a young person or an older person and asked to perform rabbinical services for a group of 30 to 40 people, I'd be damn well discouraged. Okay. That would worry me. So I don't think it's realistic. Now, that's just my take on it. I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong. If somebody wants to put up $1 million and set up an endowment, well, maybe we can have a permanent rabbi here. I don't know. Okay. The other wish list other thing that I would think about is that the question of identity, who we are as a religious group or as a social group or whatever we may be, has never been clearly articulated in any way that I'm aware of here. We call ourselves Reform Jews, but most people, I tell you, we've got an ignorant laity. That's number one. And I'm not pointing any fingers. I mean, obviously, I don't have all the information and the knowledge I would like to have about our traditions, our background and everything. I think I have a fairly good idea of what goes on and what should go on. But in order to be committed to something, you have to understand what you're committed to.
Right.
And to me, I would like to see, well, Helen and I have underwritten at Hebrew Union College, for example, sort of retreats for that purpose. We had one at Miami University, was the last one we've had in the East, where you really get some of your top scholars to come and talk. Of course, this is my old.
Yeah, right.
You're getting into my town and gown thing.
Yeah.
I've always thought this. I always felt that there's a hunger in human beings, whatever their stats may be, professionally or personally or anything, for more understanding of the world that they live in, the environment they live in, and you don't have to be an academic, you don't have to be a business person, these things can work together. I'm getting back to Walter Pepke's famous thing out in Colorado. What is it? The
Aspen Institute?
The Aspen Institute concept. That was 50 or 60 years ago.
Right.
But there have been lots of these kind of things. That, to me, is kind of where I come out on this thing. I would like to see.
Good
I would like to see that kind of emphasis. That's why, for example, whenever Helen and I give any money to Harvard or to IU or to wherever we give, it's always for program, for continuity, never for buildings or for structures or
not for brick and mortar.
Not for brick and mortar.
I understand that.
That's it.
My final question is my working hypothesis, which goes something like this. If there had not been a Ball State University and a Ball Memorial Hospital, I guess now Cardinal Health Services, there might not be all that much of a future for Temple Bethel. Do you think that's accurate?
I concur, absolutely. Yeah, I think that, well.
What's the question?
My hypothesis is that comparing now with 23 years ago when Dwight and I did the original interviews, if it had not been for the hospital bringing medical people here and the university bringing academics here, who now play a very important role in the life of Temple Bethel, there might not be much of a future for Temple Bethel if those people weren't there.
I concur.
Well, you don't have a temple without a congregation.
Okay.
Well, that's the point.
Okay, but the point is that the congregation has changed so significantly that if one were to compare a directory of a quarter of a century ago and a directory of 2003, it's very, very different people. And it's a more diverse congregation. It's a congregation that comes with very different backgrounds from different parts of the United States. And so when I now see the people who are the real active members of Temple Bethel, they are people who in most cases have been brought here by the university to be academics or by the hospital or Cardinal Health Services, whatever, to practice medicine. So if you take those people out of the congregation, there isn't a whole heck of a lot left. Now, that's not to say anything negative about the people who are left.
Yeah.
It's just that there isn't much of a critical mass.
But the complexity, society changes everywhere.
Yeah, sure.
And here the emphasis now is more on academics and medical.
Well, they're the two largest employers in Muncie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. I mean, that could occur in any community.
If the congregation is going to grow, then the growth has to come from additions to the medical community and additions
to
the faculty.
Yeah, so
It's not going to be additions to people who are going to come here for business purposes.
That's exactly
Well,
right.
how much difference do you think that makes?
Well, it makes
Makes
all the
a lot
difference in
in
the
terms
world.
of the numbers. I mean, as one person said to me in one of my interviews, when I asked about the wish list, she said, well, what this congregation really needs would be 30 more families. And I can understand that because it would increase the numbers, and if you have the 30 additional families who are Jewish, then you make a lot of other things happen.
That's exactly right.
Well, if that ever were to happen in Muncie, Indiana, over the next couple of decades, these will almost have to be people who would come here because of academic opportunities or medical opportunities.
Yeah, unless there's some other major change in the economic structure of the society around, and I don't see that right now.
Well, yeah, I guess in fairness, as a couple people again, since we're, as you know, at the end of the interview process in the study, there have been some people who have brought up at this juncture, well, maybe all this Vision 2006 and other things that take place right now in Muncie will create a new sort of Muncie Silicon Valley, and all of a sudden will be, we will become part of the next wave of technology, and that will bring all kinds of people to Muncie. Well, fine.
Well,
If that happens, I'm happy,
Yeah, I
and
am
I
too.
wish it would. I'm being realistic about this. Right now, you have two major employers in this community, and they're going to continue for the foreseeable future to be the major employers in this town. And they are medical people, academic people.
Right.
Areas of expertise in which we know there happen to be a fair number of Jewish people. And so if you can attract some of those people to come to Ball State, to come to the hospital, the likelihood of having some of those families be part of a growth pattern at Temple Bethel would be all that much greater.
Yeah, but you know, this is a, as you said, a wish list.
Yeah, this is a wish list.
This
yeah.
is, you know, maybe smoke and.
Yeah.
And it could be a reality as well.
Well, it could
Nobody
be.
can predict the future.
Well, I think it's less of a smoke and mirrors game than talking about technology.
Yeah, that's true.
And us becoming the next version of Silicon Valley in East Central Indiana.
I don't think that's realistic. I think more medical stuff. There's a lot of emphasis on the medical here in the building and the university.
I
Now,
would agree.
let me make another comment about this. The problem, with the exception of our wonderful doctors who contributed the addition,
Right.
most of the development, the building of the original synagogue, and the maintenance of it came from people who were self-employed,
Oh, sure.
entrepreneurs that
Right.
don't exist anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, it's been my observation that usually academics, I'm not making a disparaging remark, I'm just saying, are not that geared to what we Jews traditionally called tzedakah, charity.
Well, you can spell
Giving,
that too.
giving.
Yeah.
Spell tzedakah.
Well, it's
T-S or
T-Z-A-D-A-C-A or K-A. I mean, it's you're anglicizing charity.
Yeah.
There was a tradition in Jewish life that is dying out, unfortunately, of you always gave.
Yeah, well, hence the great success of the United Jewish Appeal.
You got it.
Yeah.
You got it.
Right.
And hence the difficulties they're having now because the younger generation simply isn't geared or doesn't know about this kind of thing. My point is that a lot of these things that happened before happened from people who felt committed to give money to. Now, I've been sort of on the periphery of the money situation for many years of this congregation.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm amazed at the number of very bright people who simply don't get it. Well, you know, you got the building, you have a student rabbi, because you know, well, so what's the big deal? Well, you got to pay them. You know, that's the problem.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
And this somehow doesn't filter through.
It doesn't translate.
I don't know why. I don't know why it is.
Maybe it's generational. I don't know.
Is it?
I
don't know.
think it is. I think it is because.
To some degree.
Well, I'll tell you why. There has been such an undue emphasis on child rearing, such a mishigas, such a big fuss with psychologists and psychiatrists who have overplayed their hands entirely, because after all, what are we bringing up? We're bringing up, we hope, human beings, not idols, not dolls, not mechanical toys.
No, you're right.
You asked me about my wish list.
Yeah.
I, of course, have a lot of emotional ties and wishes to this little congregation because this is where everything has happened. And I would like to see continuity. It will only come, in my judgment, from doing some of the things that we're doing now and maybe doing them better, people feeling that they are part of a tradition, a congregation. I don't think that religious fervor per se is going to keep them together. There are other things about being Jewish, about continuity, about tradition, if you will, that will be important to them. But that won't last either unless they become educated, unless they learn what it is that is worthwhile preserving and why. Now, I know people would argue with me, say, well, if you don't bring God into it, you're whistling Dixie. Well, I'll bring God into it if that's what it takes, but it doesn't make me a true believer, you know what I mean?
Well, that's a good note to end on. Those are all the questions I have. Are there any other comments or perspectives that you'd like to offer for posterity?
Well,
or we pretty much covered.
I think we've covered a lot of them, but
covered all that we want to cover.
Unfortunately, Warren, I don't know what posterity is going to be interested in, or what it will want to know about what we have done here, or are doing, or thinking about. But it may be that there will be a kernel in some of the things that we've said that might be used as a sort of an acorn that will grow an oak sometimes later in the future. I don't know what else to say.
Well, there's no question that there are a lot of good things going on currently at Temple Bethel. And I think that really gives people like you and Helen, and certainly me as an outsider, a lot of faith in what the